and welcome to part 3 of making scientific figures with Adobe Illustrator. This is when things start to get more fun. So we're going to do fills, patterns, so we're going to make atomic lattices. So first, let's make some shapes. Now the first thing I want to show that I didn't cover in the other section was the different ways that we can fill shapes. So let's make these different. These are all solid fills, but you can actually control the way that the fills are done. So let's overlap these two just to explain what I want to talk about. So we can make a shape more translucent by changing the opacity. So suppose we make this 50%, and now this shape is 50% transparent. But notice that the same thing happens to the fill, right? Everything is transparent. You can change that by only applying to the fill. So let's go back out. So if we select the object and we go to appearance, the appearance panel is really important. It's telling you what's happening to the fill and to the stroke. So here we can see that this object that I have highlighted, it has a stroke and it has a fill. What these eyeballs are telling you if you can actually see these features. So if I click the stroke off, so it turns the eyeball off, you don't see that stroke anymore. And now you turn it back on. And let's make this a little bit easier to see. So turning the stroke on and off. And it's just showing you whether it's there or not with the eyeball. And here's the fill. Notice that each of these have their own opacity. So I'm going to make just the filling of this feature translucent. So I'm going to make it 50%. And notice now that the border is still dark, right? It has a default opacity of 100%, but now the fill is transparent. So this is actually comes up fairly often when making figures. Now, let's turn this back to 100%. So that was making it transparent. I can also change the filling by multiplying. So if we go to opacity here, what this is saying is that this fill is 100% opaque. However, I can change what that fill is doing. So instead of normal is just you're seeing that actual color. We can do multiply. And what multiply is doing is that it's multiplying it's making it almost as a translucent mask in front of the other object. So you can still see the other object, which is behind this blue square with some sort of fill, but now it's mathematically multiplying this red color by the blue that's behind it. And so this is actually fairly useful when composing figures. Okay, so those are the different fills. I want to show another type of fill which people will use pretty often, which is the gradient tool. So if we click gradient, if we highlight our object, so this preview here is telling us that the current selected object, it has a blue fill and a black border. So we can change the fill by clicking on the fill. So now this blue part is up front. And now let's choose this black gradient. So now we have this gradient here that goes from left to right and it's black. To edit the gradient, so there's this angle here, I'm going to scroll up and you can see that I can change the direction of that gradient. We can also put 90 degrees. And to change the colors that's part of this gradient, you just double click. So instead of black, we can make it end in, let's say, red. And right now the starting color is white, but let's make it something else. Let's make it blue. And we can change the way that these two colors are interpolated by dragging this slider here. Whenever you want to add more colors, just click down and notice that the arrow will change. Now we see this plus sign. So if I add another color, double click, let's put in yellow. So this is how we can create different gradient fills. And notice that this also works with straight lines. So if I make some sort of, line this way, and let's make this terminate down here. Okay, so that's how to create gradients. If you want to save this gradient, if you want to save it for later, you click on this tab, and down here you can add to the swatches. So if I click that, now if I go to my swatch panel, so you go to Window and Swatches, we now see a preview there. We have that new gradient swatch that we just created. So let's say we fill this other object, we click, and now it has that same gradient that we want. And so you can create all sorts of gradients. If you create one you really like it, just save them for later. And later in workflow, I'll show you how to, you can save this swatch later with all your favorite ones that you've created. Okay, so now some fun stuff. We're going to create atomic lattices. This is a really cool thing to do. So let's start out with let's do a rectangular lattice. So I'm going to draw a rectangle here. I'm going to get rid of that fill. I'm going to make it empty. And I'm going to reduce the stroke to 2. For now, this box is just going to be a guide to the eye to where to put the atoms. So let's hit L for the ellipse tool. I'm going to switch the fill to black, and I'm going to zoom in here. So if I notice that as soon as I hover over a corner, it shows anchor, I'm going to click Alt and Shift to create an atom there. V to direct select tool so that I can duplicate it along this corner there. Highlight both of them, use Alt to click and drag and put them at that corner. I'm going to click and drag and put another one right at the center of the square there. Let's shrink it and make it a different color. Let's make it red. Okay, so now we're ready to turn this into a repeating atomic shape. Now this black square was just used as a guide to the eye so that we can place our atoms in the right positions. Now I'll go on to make it empty. Now this is actually really important. So what we want to do is that this is going to be how we're going to tile our atomic lattice or pattern. We're going to make a pattern out of it. This has to be all the way in the back. So we're going to highlight this empty shape, this empty path, Command Shift left bracket. So now it's all the way in the back. If you don't do that, make that mistake, you'll see what happens. So I'm going to highlight everything here. And just to be safe, I'm going to group it. Now let me click and drag it over to the palette, over to the swatch panel. Now notice there's a preview there that looks like our pattern. So here's the cool thing. So now let me go into my pen tool. I'm going to select that pattern that we just dragged over. Let's give it a black border. Now I'm going to click and make a shape. And you can see that it's filling it in with that pattern that we just made. Notice that it has the same size of that. So if we want to change the scale and the rotation of that fill, we right click. So first highlight the object. We're going to right click, go to transform, and then scale. So notice that it's changing the size of the object too. That's not what we want. So notice that if I scale here, it's scaling everything proportionally. What we want to do is instead just scale the transform patterns. We just want to scale the pattern. So now if I scroll down, notice we're filling it with that pattern that we just created. And if we want to change the orientation, we right click again, go to rotate. Again, make sure that just the pattern is highlighted. If we highlight both, notice that it rotates both of them together. Instead, what we want is the same shape, but we want to rotate the pattern. So this is really cool. So that's how you would do a rectangular lattice. But notice that the way that it's going to tile it, it's always going to be based on a rectangle. So suppose that we wanted to make instead a hexagonal pattern. I should note that you can make hexagonal patterns by going to Object, Pattern, and then Make. I prefer doing it using rectangles. It's just a little bit easier for me. So let's make, suppose, a graphene lattice. Let's go to Polygon Tool. We want to do 6, okay. And let's make it down here. I'm going to click Option Shift. Let's get rid of that fill. It still has the atomic fill. And I want to keep this highlighted. So let's highlight the shape. Now what we want to do is tile this shape. So if you think about it for a second, what we want to do is, so I'm making a duplicate. So I'm holding down Alt, but I want to make that duplicate directly above this one. So I'm holding down Shift. Notice that I have that intersection, so they're locked right on top of each other. And so I want to make another duplicate in the Y direction, but down here. So Alt and then Shift down. There we go. And to make sure that you don't scale it, you click on some other part. You don't click on the handle, you click on the actual object. So this is a detail, but this is actually extremely useful. If you try to make another duplicate, so let's choose 2 of these. I'm going to click it from this corner. And I'm going to put them right on top. So now these are locked. So I'm going to highlight these 2 hexagons here. I'm going to click them right at the corner and then put them right at this corner here. So this is a really useful trick. When you want to duplicate something, click it from the corner where you want to lock it later. Okay. Now, for making atomic lattices or patterns, you really want to make sure that everything is well lined up. So one way to check that is to go into outline mode. So in outline mode, I'll zoom out so you can see what happens. There's no fills, there's no strokes, you're just looking at what the object is. So it's really important to go into outline mode and make sure that your lattice is perfect and that everything is locked right on top of all the other corners. So this actually looks good. Just doing a double check. Okay. So now we can go back into fill mode. It's Command Y or just view outline. So now we can populate this with some atoms. So I'm going L. Let's reverse the 2. If I go to right to this corner, it's telling me where their anchor point is. I'm going to drag using Alt and Shift. Now I just want to make a duplicate of this one and put it right here. And notice I made a mistake. When you want to duplicate something, you want to do it right at the center. You see that intersection point there. Let's click and drag here. I'm just using Alt, and I'm using Shift to drag it along the horizontal direction. So I'm clicking and dragging here. These are in the right position. Putting these in the right direction. So selecting the objects, Alt to duplicate, and then holding down Shift to put them in the right position. Okay. So I've done this a few times to know that the repeating rectangular shape is this one. So I'm going to hit M for rectangle tool. I'm going to click right at the center. So first let's choose, now this is just as a visual inspection. I'm going to go from this center to this center. And I'm going to make the stroke thick just so you can see it. So actually I did this wrong. So this would have given the wrong lattice. And I want to put it actually right in the center of these hexagons here. So even though I've done this several times, it's always easy to mess this up. So this is the repeating shape. Notice that when I tile this, the next tile over is going to be equidistant from this atom. So when I go to the right, I'll hop over here. So this is the repeating shape. I'll make this empty now. So this is going to be our shape. Actually, let's go back. Remember, it has to be all the way in the back, and it's all the way in the front. So this actually won't work. So Command Shift left brace. So now this is all the way behind. So this is defining our repeating shape. Make it empty. Now this is a really kind of technical thing when you're making these lattices, but if you don't, actually I'm gonna do it the wrong way just so you can see what happens. So let's suppose that this is the cell that we want to make. Let's click and drag it, just like our other lattice, and put it there. Now let's make a circle over here. Let's see what that fill looks like. So I can select everything. I'll group it just so I can make it a little bit smaller. And let's fill something with that pattern that we just made. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to scale it like I did before. And there goes the repeating shape. To make it a little bit bigger. So one problem, we don't see it now, but one problem that can happen, since these features are one-dimensional, it's happened before, not this time, is that it's the safest way to make these lattices. Sometimes you'll see really almost invisible 1-pixel lines here. They're actually pretty annoying. One way to get rid of that, if you do see them, is to expand the object. So if we choose all of our 1D hexagons, so these are now groups, so I'm going to double click to go into the group. I can use the magic wand tool, Y. So let's select everything with the same stroke, Y. And remember, these are 1D objects, except they have some thick stroke. I'm going to expand them into 2D objects. So path, outline, stroke. And then now notice these are 2D things. And doing that one trick actually will help you a lot. Sometimes you hear, in this case we didn't see them, but it actually does happen a lot. So if you do see it, that's the one thing you should do. Go back, change your paths, change the strokes into outline paths. So now I'm going to click and drag to our palette. And we have our other atoms. So here's the really nice thing is you can save these atomic patterns that you've made in your swatches. And you can also edit them. So I can delete this one. I can get it out of the way. If you ever want to go back and edit them, you can just click and do the opposite. Drag them here. So suppose we want to now change our atoms. So make every other atom a different color. Let's say red. Highlight them, change the fill, escape. So these things are still grouped. I can click and drag and put it back. And now we have a completely different fill, different atoms there. So this is one way to, quickly change them, or you don't have to, have an empty Illustrator file with different atoms. You just save your palettes here, and if you ever want to quickly edit them, just click and drag them and put them into your artboard. So that's one really quick way also to increase your workflow. You don't always have to recreate things or save things. Remember your past file. Just save this one swatches. You can even create your own custom swatch, with atomic lattices. Okay, so one more thing about fills is that fills act, there's a hierarchy to fills. So if I click on this object with this atomic fill, and we go down to appearance again, remember appearance is telling us all the features of this object. It's telling us it has a stroke weight of 4, it has this atomic fill, but we can add more fills on top of it. So if I highlight down here, it says add new fill. If I click one more, it duplicates the other fill that was there, and it says that this one is on top, which means I can change the fill of this bottom one. I can make it blue. So something like this is really useful instead of making a separate circle and putting it underneath. So this will really just increase your workflow. So let's do another example, combining these things. And this has been something that's been of popular recently. Let's do a Moire lattice. And we'll see that it derives from just stacking two things on top of each other that have a slightly different periodicity. So I made a hexagon and I filled it with our lattice. Now let's scale it like we did before. So scale, just the pattern. And let's make this, let's make it pretty small. So there goes one. Now I want to make a duplicate, so I used Alt to duplicate it. Now if I just drag directly on top. Now let's rotate one with respect to the other. So transform, rotate. If we go now near 0, we can see a separate lattice start to appear, a super lattice, just by rotating two lattices of the same periodicity, which is really cool. So we can actually actively just see it change. Now we can also get a Moire lattice by changing the periodicity itself. So let's highlight one of these flakes, and now let's just scale it without rotation. So it's really small there. So notice there's a new periodicity. Can you see it? And it happens just by making the exact same lattice, except one is slightly shrunk compared to the other one. And so this type of lattice, of course, you see when graphene is on top of something like hexagonal boron nitride or copper. So that's one really cool example of quickly making these kind of complex patterns simply by making a simple atomic lattice and dragging it over to your swatch tool, into the swatch panel. And now one way to really increase your workflow in the future is to just save all of your swatches, if you tend to use certain lattices over and over again, is to save them into your swatch panel and then reuse it. Instead of making a separate file or constantly open previous files, just save all your swatches, all your gradients, and make them the default ones. And I'll talk about that later on our section on journal templates and using templates in general. Okay, so that's it for this section. The next time I will talk about effects. So this is the one that people really enjoy. I'll show how to make 3D objects, revolve shapes, drop shadows, and other hints on how to increase your workflow by using graphic styles.